Marcus Kane stood at the edge of the crystalline cliff, watching the twin suns of Drakmor set behind the jagged mountains. His scarred hands gripped the worn handle of his plasma rifle, the only companion that had never abandoned him. Below in the valley, the lights of New Terra Colony flickered like dying stars, a reminder of everything he had lost. The court-martial had been swift and merciless. 3 years ago, Commander Kane had refused a direct order to bombard a civilian settlement on Kepler 438b, believing intelligence reports of hidden insurgent weapons were fabricated. He had been right, but that hardly mattered to the Terran Military Council. Insubordination was insubordination, regardless of moral justification. They stripped him of his rank, his honor, and his home in a single afternoon. Now he scraped by as a freelance security contractor on this godforsaken frontier world, taking jobs nobody else wanted. The latest assignment had brought him to the Whispering Peaks, a treacherous mountain range where few humans dared to venture. Local mining corporations reported strange energy readings deep in the caverns, along with the disappearance of several survey teams. They wanted someone expendable to investigate. Marcus adjusted his environmental suit and began his descent into the valley. The air grew thicker as he moved away from the plateau, carrying unfamiliar scents that made his skin crawl. Something ancient lived in these mountains, something that predated human colonization by millennia. The locals spoke in hushed whispers of creatures that soared through the clouds, beings of scales and fire that had ruled this world since time immemorial. Dragons. The word felt foolish even thinking it, but Marcus had seen enough impossible things in his travels to keep an open mind. The galaxy was vast and full of wonders that defied human understanding. If dragon-like creatures existed on Drakmor, it would explain why so few expeditions returned from the deep wilderness. His boots crunched on the crystalline sand as he approached a narrow canyon entrance. The walls rose hundreds of meters on either side, carved smooth by eons of wind and weather. Strange symbols were etched into the rock face, glowing faintly with an inner light that his equipment couldn't identify. They seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat, as if responding to his presence. The canyon led deeper into the mountain, branching into a network of natural tunnels that descended far below the surface. Marcus activated his helmet lights and checked his oxygen reserves. The air down here was breathable but thin, requiring him to move slowly to avoid exhaustion. His motion sensors picked up movement in the shadows, but whatever creatures inhabited these depths seemed more curious than hostile. As he ventured deeper, the walls began to change. The rough stone gave way to smooth surfaces that reflected his lights like polished mirrors. Bioluminescent fungi provided additional illumination, casting everything in an ethereal blue-green glow. The temperature rose steadily, suggesting he was approaching some kind of geothermal source. After hours of careful navigation, Marcus emerged into a vast underground chamber that took his breath away. The cavern stretched for kilometers in every direction, its ceiling lost in darkness far above. Crystalline formations jutted from the floor like a frozen forest, and streams of molten rock flowed through channels carved into the walls. But what truly amazed him were the structures. They were clearly artificial, yet unlike anything humans had ever built. Graceful spires twisted toward the ceiling, their surfaces covered in the same glowing symbols he had seen at the canyon entrance. Bridges of some translucent material spanned the lava flows, connecting platforms that seemed to float in mid-air. This was a city, ancient beyond measure but maintained in perfect condition. Marcus moved cautiously through the empty streets, his footsteps echoing in the silence. There were no signs of current habitation, but the architecture suggested beings much larger than humans had once lived here. Doorways soared 20 meters high, and the furniture he glimpsed through openings was scaled for creatures of enormous size. At the heart of the city stood a massive pyramid, its apex crowned with a sphere of pure energy that pulsed like a living heart. As Marcus approached, he felt a strange sensation, as if invisible eyes were watching his every move. The sensation wasn't threatening, merely curious, like a cat observing an interesting new toy. The pyramid's entrance was guarded by 2 enormous statues that Marcus realized weren't statues at all. They were sleeping dragons, their scales shifting slowly with each breath. One was deep crimson with golden highlights, the other midnight blue with silver markings. They were beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, embodying a power that made his military training feel inadequate. Between them lay an archway that beckoned him forward. Against every instinct screaming for him to flee, Marcus stepped through the entrance. The interior was a single vast chamber filled with soft golden light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. At the center, arranged in a perfect circle, were 7 enormous eggs. Each egg was the size of a small vehicle, its surface smooth as polished marble, but warm to the touch. They glowed with an inner fire that spoke of life waiting to emerge. Marcus felt an overwhelming urge to protect them, stronger than any emotion he had experienced since his disgrace. These weren't just eggs. They were the future of an entire species. A low rumble echoed through the chamber, and Marcus spun to see the 2 guardian dragons had awakened. They moved with fluid grace despite their massive size, positioning themselves between him and the eggs. Their eyes held ancient intelligence and a sadness that cut through his soul. They were the last of their kind, he realized, waiting for their children to hatch in a world that no longer welcomed their presence. The red dragon spoke, its voice resonating directly in Marcus's mind rather than through sound. The words came in images and emotions rather than language, but their meaning was crystal clear. The eggs were dying. Some poison in the air, some change in the world's harmony was slowly killing the unhatched dragons. They needed help that their ancient guardians couldn't provide. Marcus looked at the magnificent creatures before him and made a decision that would change everything. He had lost his honor defending innocence once before. Perhaps it was time to find it again by protecting the innocent once more, regardless of the species. He would help them, whatever the cost. The blue dragon stepped forward, her massive head lowering until she was eye level with Marcus. When she spoke, her mental voice carried the weight of centuries and the gentleness of a mother watching over her children. She called herself Azura, last mother of the cloud dancers, and her companion was Pirion, last father of the flame bearers. Through their shared consciousness, Marcus learned the tragic history of Drakmor's dragons. They had once soared freely through the planet's skies, living in harmony with the world's natural energies. Their civilization had been built on understanding rather than conquest, wisdom rather than war. But the arrival of human colonists had changed everything. It wasn't intentional malice that doomed the dragons, but simple ignorance. The terraforming machines humans used to make the atmosphere more suitable for their biology had disrupted delicate energy patterns that dragons depended on for survival. Mining operations had severed ley lines that carried life force through the planet's core. Industrial pollution had poisoned the very air that dragon eggs needed to properly develop. One by one, the great nests had fallen silent. Dragon populations plummeted as fewer eggs hatched successfully each year. The proud flying cities had been abandoned as their inhabitants either died or retreated to the deepest sanctuaries where old magic still flowed strong. Now only Azura and Pirion remained, guardians of the last clutch their kind would ever produce. Marcus felt their despair as if it were his own. These magnificent beings faced extinction not through war or catastrophe, but through the slow degradation of everything their species needed to survive. The 7 eggs before him represented the final hope for an entire civilization, spanning millions of years. But there was something else in the dragons' shared memories, something that made Marcus's heart race with possibility. Dragon eggs didn't just need clean air and natural energy to hatch. They required the presence of a bonded guardian, someone whose life force could supplement their own during the crucial final stages of development. Traditionally, this role had been filled by other dragons, but those days were gone forever. The guardians needed to be brave, compassionate, and willing to sacrifice everything for the protection of their charges. Most importantly, they needed to possess what dragons called a warm heart, a pure intention to nurture life regardless of personal cost. Few beings in the galaxy possessed such qualities, but Azura and Pirion sensed it burning bright within the disgraced human soldier standing before them. Marcus understood what they were asking. To save the eggs, he would need to remain in the sanctuary indefinitely, sharing his life energy with the developing dragons until they were strong enough to hatch. The process could take months or even years, and there was no guarantee he would survive the experience. Dragon bonding was intense and often fatal to non-dragons who attempted it. He thought of his empty life on the surface, the meaningless jobs and endless isolation that awaited him. Then he looked at the 7 glowing eggs and felt a purpose he hadn't experienced since his military days. These children deserved a chance at life, deserved to carry their species' legacy into the future. If his sacrifice could make that possible, it was a price worth paying. Marcus removed his helmet and breathed the sanctuary's ancient air. It tasted of fire and starlight, of dreams made manifest and hopes given form. When he placed his hands on the nearest egg, he felt the life stirring within respond to his touch. The shell grew warmer, its inner light pulsing faster as the dragon inside sensed a potential guardian's presence. Azura and Pyrion began the bonding ritual, their voices harmonizing in tones that made the chamber walls resonate like a vast musical instrument. The ceremony was older than human civilization, a sacred process that linked souls across the boundaries of species and biology. Marcus felt his consciousness expanding, touching the minds of 7 unborn dragons who welcomed him with innocent joy. The first weeks passed in a blur of wonder and exhaustion. Marcus learned to share his dreams with the developing dragons, showing them glimpses of the wider galaxy through his memories. They were curious about everything, asking endless questions about human culture, technology, and philosophy. In return, they shared their own ancestral knowledge, teaching him about the deep connections between all living things. He discovered that dragons saw the universe very differently than humans. Where people perceived separate objects and distinct individuals, dragons sensed the underlying unity that connected everything. They understood that harming one part of the web of existence inevitably damaged the whole, which explained their horror at humanity's casual destruction of natural systems. As the eggs grew stronger, Marcus grew weaker. The bonding process was slowly draining his life force, transferring his vitality to the dragons who needed it to complete their development. Azura and Pyrion tried to help, sharing their own ancient power when they could. But even their strength was limited after centuries of isolation and sorrow. Marcus didn't regret his choice. Each day brought him closer to 7 magnificent beings who would soon take flight and restore wonder to Drakmoor's skies. He felt their personalities developing, each one unique and precious. There was Ember, fierce and protective like her father Pyrion. Nova sparkled with curiosity about the stars beyond their world. Sage possessed wisdom that seemed far older than his unborn state should allow, but the outside world hadn't forgotten about Marcus Kane. His employers grew concerned when he failed to report in, and search parties were dispatched to find their missing contractor. The mining corporations that had hired him weren't interested in his welfare, but they were very interested in the energy readings their satellites had detected coming from deep within the mountains. The first human expedition reached the outer canyons just as the dragon eggs entered, their final stage of development. Marcus felt their approach through his connection to the sanctuary's guardian systems, ancient defenses that had protected this place for millennia. The intruders carried heavy weapons and mining equipment, clearly intending to claim whatever treasures they found regardless of the consequences. Azura and Pyrion prepared for battle, their massive forms radiating lethal grace as they took defensive positions. But Marcus knew they were weakened by years of sorrow and the energy they had shared with the eggs. The approaching humans carried weapons designed to kill creatures much larger and more dangerous than themselves. In a direct confrontation, even dragons might fall. The eggs were too close to hatching to be moved, too vulnerable to survive disruption of the bonding process. Someone would need to hold the line until the 7 new dragons could emerge and escape to safety. Marcus checked his weapons and smiled grimly. Perhaps this was how his story was meant to end, not in disgrace, but in a final stand protecting innocents who couldn't protect themselves. As the sound of human voices echoed through the ancient halls, Marcus Kane prepared for the most important battle of his life. The first human scout entered the Dragon City at dawn, his boots echoing off crystalline streets that had known only silence for centuries. Marcus watched from a concealed position atop one of the floating platforms, tracking the intruder's movement through the scope of his plasma rifle. The man wore corporate security armor bearing the logo of Meridian Mining Consortium, one of the largest resource extraction companies operating in this sector. Behind the scout came a full squad of armed mercenaries, followed by a team of scientists and engineers. Their equipment cases bore warning labels for explosive charges, atmospheric processors, and containment fields. These people hadn't come to study the Dragon Sanctuary. They had come to strip mine it for whatever valuable materials they could find. Marcus's enhanced hearing picked up fragments of their radio chatter. The team leader, A woman with the cold voice of someone accustomed to turning profit from others' suffering was already discussing excavation schedules and asset recovery protocols. To her, this place was nothing more than an archaeological site to be plundered and sold to the highest bidder. The eggs were now glowing so brightly that their light could be seen from the city's outer edges. According to Azura and Pyrion, the hatching would begin within hours. The 7 young dragons inside were fully formed and eager to emerge, but they remained vulnerable during those crucial first moments of life. Any disruption of the sanctuary's energy field could kill them. Before they took their first breath, Marcus had spent the last 3 days setting traps and defensive positions throughout the approaches to the pyramid. His military training served him well as he turned the ancient city into a maze of crossfires and bottlenecks. But he was one man against a well-equipped army, and eventually they would overwhelm his defenses through sheer numbers. The corporate team reached the city's central plaza just as the first egg began to crack. Marcus felt a surge of joy and terror through his bond with the developing dragons. Ember, the fierce little female who reminded him so much of her father, was ready to enter the world. Her siblings stirred in response to her movements, their own hatching triggered by some instinct older than time itself. Marcus opened fire. His first shot took down the team leader before she could react, the plasma bolt burning through her armor like paper. Chaos erupted as the mercenaries scrambled for cover, their confident advance turning into desperate confusion. Marcus had positioned himself well, using the ancient architecture to create overlapping fields of fire that forced his enemies into predictable choke points. But the corporate forces were professionals, and they adapted quickly to the threat. Within minutes they had identified his position and began laying down suppressing fire, while flanking squads moved to surround him. Marcus was forced to abandon his overwatch position, falling back toward the pyramid through a running battle that left bodies scattered across the pristine crystal streets. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of hatching beginning in earnest. 7 distinct voices called out in the ancient dragon tongue, announcing their arrival to a world that no longer welcomed their kind. The sound filled Marcus with desperate strength, pushing him beyond the limits of human endurance as he fought to buy them precious time. A plasma grenade exploded near his shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into a wall. Blood ran down his face as he struggled to maintain his grip on his rifle. The mercenaries were closing in, their superior numbers and equipment finally telling against his skill and determination. But he had achieved his primary objective. The dragons were hatching. Azura and Pyrion emerged from the pyramid in all their terrible glory, their massive forms radiating power that made the air itself seem to burn. The ancient dragons had held back during the initial fighting, unwilling to leave their charges undefended, but now their children were safely emerging into the world. It was time to remind these invaders why dragons had once ruled the skies of 1,000 worlds. The battle that followed was less fight than natural disaster. Pyrion's breath weapon turned sand to glass and metal to vapor, while Azura's control over atmospheric pressure created winds that lifted armed humans like leaves in a hurricane. The surviving mercenaries fled in terror, their corporate bravado evaporating in the face of creatures that existed outside their understanding of the possible. But the damage was done. Marcus lay bleeding among the crystal formations, his body broken by the grenade blast and the strain of the bonding process. He could feel his life force ebbing away, the last of his vitality spent in protecting the sanctuary during its most vulnerable moment. The 7 newly hatched dragons surrounded him, their voices keening with distress as they sensed their guardians approaching death. Through dimming vision, Marcus saw them clearly for the first time. They were magnificent beyond description, each one unique in coloring and bearing. Ember's scales shimmered like living fire, while Nova sparkled with the light of distant stars. Sage bore markings that seemed to shift and change as Marcus watched, and the others each displayed their own particular beauty. But they were also tiny, no larger than house cats despite their impressive wingspan. It would be years before they grew large enough to survive on their own, decades before they could hope to restore their species to its former glory. Without a guardian to protect and guide them, they would likely perish before reaching maturity. Azura approached Marcus, her massive head bowing low in a gesture of profound respect. Through their mental link, she spoke words that would echo in his consciousness even as darkness closed around him. She named him Brother of Dragons, Guardian of the Last Flight, protector of tomorrow's hope. His sacrifice would be remembered for as long as dragon voices could sing his story. Marcus smiled as he felt the young dragons pressing close to him, their small bodies warm against his cooling skin. He had spent his life believing he was a failure, a man whose principles had cost him everything he valued. But in these final moments, surrounded by 7 perfect beings who owed their lives to his protection, he understood that some failures were actually the greatest victories of all. The last thing he saw before his eyes closed forever was Ember spreading her tiny wings and taking her first flight, soaring in a perfect circle around the chamber where her guardian lay dying. She sang as she flew, her voice high and clear and filled with all the promise of a species reborn. It was the most beautiful sound Marcus had ever heard. As his heartbeat slowed and finally stopped, Marcus Kane felt no regret. He had found his honor again in the most unexpected place, defending innocents who would carry his memory into a future he would never see. The disgraced soldier had become something greater than he ever imagined possible. He had become a legend that would inspire generations of dragons yet to come. But death, it turned out, was not the end of Marcus Kane's story. It was merely the beginning of something far more extraordinary than any human had ever experienced before. Marcus floated in warm darkness, consciousness drifting like mist through an endless void. He should have been dead. He remembered the weight leaving his chest, the final breath escaping his lungs as the 7 young dragons sang their farewell. Yet somehow he persisted, awareness intact but transformed beyond anything he had experienced in life. Gradually, he became aware of other presences in the darkness. Ancient voices whispered in languages that predated human speech, carrying the accumulated wisdom of dragons who had died millennia before his birth. They welcomed him with reverence and joy, calling him by titles that made no sense to his human understanding. Soul Singer, Heart Flame, the one who chose love over life. A massive presence approached through the void, its consciousness vast as a planet and old as starlight. When it spoke, Marcus felt the fundamental forces of creation respond to its voice. This was the first dragon, the progenitor of all the winged children who had ever taken flight beneath alien suns. It had been waiting eons for a being worthy of the gift it could bestow. Through waves of understanding that bypassed language entirely, the first dragon explained what had happened. Marcus's sacrifice had resonated through dimensions of reality that humans couldn't perceive, creating ripples in the fabric of existence itself. His willingness to die protecting innocent life had touched something fundamental in the universe's structure, something that rewarded such pure acts with transformation rather than oblivion. But this wasn't resurrection in any conventional sense. Marcus's physical body remained dead in the crystal chamber where Azura and Pyrian kept vigil over his remains. What persisted was something far more significant. His spirit, his essential self, refined and elevated by the magnitude of his sacrifice. He had become something new, a bridge between species that existed partially in the material world and partially in the realm of pure consciousness. The first dragon offered him a choice. He could accept peaceful rest among the honored dead, his consciousness preserved in the collective memory of dragonkind for all eternity, or he could return to the physical realm as guardian eternal, bound to protect and guide the 7 young dragons he had died to save. The second path would be difficult beyond measure, requiring him to exist as a spirit tethered to the world of the living through sheer force of will. Marcus didn't hesitate. He had made his choice in the crystal chamber when he first touched those glowing eggs. Nothing, not even death itself, would make him abandon the children who needed his protection. The first dragon smiled with infinite sadness and joy, recognizing the same devotion that had once driven the greatest heroes of dragon legend. Power flowed through Marcus as ancient magic rewove the patterns of his existence. He felt himself changing, becoming something that was neither fully human nor truly dragon, but somehow both. When the transformation completed, he opened eyes that could see across multiple dimensions of reality simultaneously. He stood once again in the crystal chamber, but his body was translucent now, composed of silver light that pulsed in rhythm with the life forces of his 7 charges. The young dragons sensed his return immediately, their joyous cries echoing off the chamber walls as they flew circles around their reborn guardian. They could see him clearly despite his spiritual nature, their dragon heritage allowing them to perceive beings who existed between the material and ethereal realms. Azura and Pyrian bowed deeply when they saw him, their ancient voices trembling with awe. In all their long lives, they had never witnessed a transformation like this. Death had not claimed their champion but elevated him, turning a mortal guardian into something that could protect his charges across the span of centuries if necessary. But Marcus quickly learned that his new existence came with both gifts and limitations. He could manifest physically when needed, becoming solid enough to interact with the material world for brief periods. His spiritual form was immune to conventional weapons and could move through solid matter at will. Most importantly, his consciousness remained linked to the 7 young dragons, allowing him to guide and protect them even when separated by vast distances. However, maintaining his presence in the physical realm required enormous effort. Extended manifestation left him weakened and forced him to retreat into the spiritual plane to recover. He could influence the material world only through acts of will, and each intervention cost him dearly in terms of energy and focus. The young dragons grew rapidly under his ethereal guidance. Marcus taught them everything he knew about surviving in a galaxy that had no place for their kind. He showed them how to hide from human detection systems, how to find sources of natural energy that could sustain them, and most importantly, how to work together as a unified flight despite their individual personalities and gifts. Ember developed into a fierce protector, her small size disguising strength that could bend steel and reflexes that made lightning seem slow. Nova's curiosity led her to master complex energy manipulations, learning to bend light and electromagnetic radiation to her will. Sage's wisdom manifested as an uncanny ability to predict danger and find solutions to seemingly impossible problems. The other 4 dragons each found their own unique gifts. Thunder could control weather patterns across vast areas, while Crystal learned to reshape matter at the molecular level. Shadow mastered the art of dimensional travel, able to step between realities like crossing a room. And Little Harmony developed the rarest gift of all, the ability to heal not just physical wounds but spiritual damage, mending broken hearts and tortured souls with her touch. Together, the 7 became something unprecedented in dragon history, a flight guided by a human spirit who understood both species' strengths and weaknesses. They learned to think strategically like humans while retaining the wisdom and perspective of their dragon heritage. Under Marcus's guidance, they began to see themselves not as the last of a dying race, but as the first of something entirely new. Word of the young dragon's existence eventually reached the corporate interests that controlled Drakmore's mining operations. The initial assault on the sanctuary had been quietly covered up to avoid awkward questions about unauthorized military action on a civilian world. But energy signatures from the hatching couldn't be hidden forever, and soon multiple corporations were sending expeditions to capture or eliminate what they saw as valuable specimens. Marcus felt each approaching threat through his connection to the sanctuary's ancient defenses. His spiritual senses could detect hostile intent from hundreds of kilometers away, giving the flight precious time to prepare or relocate as circumstances demanded. But he knew that eventually they would face enemies too numerous and well-equipped to evade. The turning point came when Meridian Mining Consortium launched a full-scale military operation to secure the Dragon Sanctuary. They brought orbital bombardment capabilities, atmospheric fighters, and enough ground forces to level a small city. Their plan was simple: capture the dragons alive if possible, destroy them if necessary, but claim the sanctuary's exotic materials regardless of the cost. Standing in the crystal chamber where he had first died, protecting 7 unborn dragons, Marcus felt the weight of destiny settling on his ethereal shoulders. The time for hiding was over. His children were strong enough now to face the galaxy on their own terms, and he would make sure they had that chance. As enemy ships darkened the sky above the Whispering Peaks, the Guardian Eternal prepared for a battle that would determine the future of 2 species and reshape the balance of power across the known galaxy. The Meridian fleet descended through Drakmore's atmosphere like falling stars, their energy shields glowing against the turbulence of re-entry. Marcus watched from the sanctuary's highest spire as dozens of assault ships took position around the Whispering Peaks, their weapons arrays charging with lethal intent. The corporate executives had learned from their previous failure. This time they brought enough firepower to reduce the entire mountain range to molten. Slag Admiral Sarah Vex commanded the operation from her flagship, a massive dreadnought bristling with particle cannons and missile batteries. Marcus had heard of her during his military service. a brilliant tactician who had never lost a planetary engagement, though her methods often left civilian casualties in the thousands. She had built her reputation on the principle that overwhelming force applied without hesitation could solve any problem. Through the quantum communication arrays of the enemy fleet, Marcus listened as Vex briefed her subordinates. The dragons were to be considered weapons of mass destruction, their capture secondary to ensuring they could never threaten corporate interests. If live specimens could be taken safely, the research value would be immense. If not, their corpses would still yield valuable genetic material for future study. The 7 young dragons had grown considerably in the months since their hatching, each now the size of a small aircraft. But they were still children by dragon standards, lacking the full power and experience that would come with maturity. In direct combat against a modern military force, they would be slaughtered despite their natural gifts. Marcus knew he had to level the playing field through cunning rather than strength. He began by manifesting his physical form throughout the sanctuary, his silver-bright figure appearing simultaneously in dozens of locations as he activated ancient defense systems that had slumbered for millennia. The crystal walls hummed with awakening power as energy conduits that had been dark since before human civilization began to glow with renewed purpose. The dragons who built this place had prepared for siege warfare on a scale that dwarfed human understanding. As the first Meridian dropships entered the mountain canyons, they encountered defenses that seemed to emerge from the very stones themselves. Automated turrets of living crystal rose from hidden alcoves, firing beams of coherent energy that could slice through military-grade armor like tissue paper. Gravity fields activated randomly throughout the approach routes, sending aircraft tumbling helplessly into canyon walls or crushing their crews with forces exceeding planetary norms. But Admiral Vex had anticipated heavy resistance. Her ships responded to the ancient defenses with coordinated bombardment that turned crystal spires to powder and carved new canyons through solid rock. For every automated turret that emerged, 10 more fell to focused fire from orbit. The Meridian forces pressed forward through the storm of defensive fire, accepting heavy casualties in exchange for steady progress toward their objective. Marcus felt each destroyed defense system like a physical blow, the sanctuary's pain echoing through his spiritual form. These mechanisms had protected dragon eggs for millions of years, maintaining their vigil long after their creators had faded into legend. Watching them fall to corporate greed filled him with a rage that transcended his human origins and touched something primordial in the dragon heritage he now shared. The 7 young dragons gathered around their guardian's manifestation, their eyes bright with eagerness for battle. Ember spoke for them all when she declared their readiness to die fighting rather than submit to capture. Her siblings echoed her determination, their individual voices harmonizing into a war song that made the chamber walls ring like struck bells. But Marcus had not guided them from birth to watch them perish in hopeless combat. Instead, he shared with them a plan that drew on both human tactical doctrine and dragon wisdom accumulated over eons. They would not meet the enemy head-on where superior numbers and technology could overwhelm them. Instead, they would strike like ghosts in the night, using their unique abilities to turn Meridian's own strengths against them. Shadow opened the first dimensional rift as enemy ground forces reached the city's outer edge. The portal led not to the sanctuary but to the Meridian flagship's engine room, 300 kilometers above. Through it stepped Marcus in his most solid manifestation, his spiritual form temporarily condensed into something that could interact with physical matter. His plasma rifle materialized in his hands as he began a surgical strike against the fleet's command structure. Aboard the flagship, alarms wailed as Marcus systematically destroyed critical systems with the precision of someone who understood military engineering from decades of experience. He wasn't trying to capture the ship, but to create enough chaos that Admiral Vex would be forced to pull back her ground forces to deal with the internal threat. Each destroyed console and severed power conduit bought precious time for the next phase of his plan. Meanwhile, Nova had taken position above the planet's atmosphere, her mastery of electromagnetic forces allowing her to survive in the vacuum of space for brief periods. She began sending precisely modulated energy pulses toward the Meridian fleet's communication arrays, creating interference patterns that disrupted their coordinated operations. Without reliable communication, the corporate forces lost much of their tactical advantage. Crystal and Harmony worked together to undermine the enemy's ground assault, the former reshaping the tunnel systems to create maze-like passages, while the latter used her healing abilities in reverse, inducing confusion and disorientation in human soldiers who found their equipment malfunctioning for no apparent reason. Thunder summoned localized storms that reduced visibility to near zero, forcing the invaders to advance blind through terrain that shifted beneath their feet. Sage coordinated the entire operation from his position in the sanctuary's heart, his prophetic abilities allowing him to anticipate Meridian's tactical responses and adjust the dragon's strategy accordingly. He guided his siblings through the battle like a master conductor directing a symphony, each movement precisely timed to achieve maximum effect with minimum risk. The corporate forces found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Their superior firepower meant nothing when they couldn't target their opponents, and their advanced technology became a liability when it stopped functioning at critical moments. Panic began to spread through the ranks as soldiers reported impossible phenomena: weapons that fired backward, gravity that reversed direction, and comm systems that broadcast dragon songs instead of tactical updates. Admiral Vex realized she was facing something beyond conventional military threats when her own flagship systems began failing in cascade patterns that suggested sabotage by someone with intimate knowledge of Terran fleet architecture. The enemy wasn't just defending their position, but actively teaching her forces that technological superiority meant nothing against beings who could rewrite the fundamental rules of engagement. Marcus reappeared in the sanctuary as his manifestation reached its limits, his spiritual form flickering with exhaustion from the sustained physical activity. But the first phase of his plan had succeeded brilliantly. The Meridian fleet was in disarray, their ground assault stalled in the crystal tunnels, and their command structure compromised by attacks they couldn't counter or even fully understand. Now came the most dangerous part. To truly break the corporate threat, Marcus would need to make them understand that the dragons weren't just dangerous opponents, but beings worthy of respect and consideration. That meant revealing truths about the universe that most humans weren't ready to accept, and demonstrating power that would reshape their understanding of what was possible. As he prepared for the final confrontation with Admiral Vex, Marcus felt the weight of two species' future resting on his ethereal shoulders. The next few hours would determine whether humanity and dragonkind could find a path to coexistence, or whether this ancient world would become the graveyard of the galaxy's last dragons. Admiral Sarah Vex stood on the bridge of her crippled flagship, watching damage reports stream across her tactical displays. In 30 years of military service, she had never encountered an enemy capable of infiltrating her ship's most secure systems, while simultaneously conducting coordinated attacks across multiple theaters of operation. Whatever these creatures were, they possessed capabilities that transcended conventional understanding of warfare. Her communication officer looked up from his console with barely controlled panic. "Admiral, we're receiving a transmission from the planet's surface. It's coming through channels that don't exist." The main viewer shimmered and resolved into an image that made Vex's blood run cold. A figure in the tattered remains of a Terran military uniform stood in what appeared to be a crystal chamber, but his body was translucent and emanated silver light. Behind him, 7 magnificent dragons arranged themselves in a protective formation, their eyes fixed on the camera with intelligent intensity. "Admiral Vex," the apparition spoke, his voice carrying across impossible distances without any technological assistance. "I am Marcus Kane, former commander of the Terran Defense Corps, currently guardian of the last flight. We need to talk." Vex recognized the name immediately. Kane had been a rising star in the military hierarchy until his court-martial for insubordination. His file listed him as killed in action on some frontier world, but the figure on her screen was unmistakably the same man. Somehow, impossibly, a dead soldier was commanding forces that had brought her fleet to the brink of defeat. "This is some kind of trick," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Advanced holography, AI manipulation, psychological warfare." Marcus smiled sadly. "You're a pragmatist, Admiral. Look at your tactical situation objectively. My children could have destroyed your entire fleet while you were still in orbit. But they didn't. They've disabled your weapons and communications while leaving your life support systems intact. Does that sound like the behavior of mindless monsters seeking destruction?" The truth was undeniable. Despite their overwhelming tactical advantage, the dragons had avoided causing casualties whenever possible. They had targeted equipment rather than personnel, creating chaos without carnage. It was the sort of surgical precision that spoke to intelligence and restraint rather than bestial aggression. "What do you want?" Vex asked, her military training taking over despite her confusion. "I want you to understand what you're really dealing with here," Marcus replied. "The beings behind me are the last of their kind. Children I died protecting because they represent something more precious than all the minerals in this mountain range. They're not weapons or specimens to be captured and studied. They're people, Admiral, as real and worthy of life as any human under your command." Through Shadow's dimensional rifts, Marcus transported Admiral Vex directly from her bridge to the crystal chamber where he stood. Her security detail reached for weapons that suddenly felt impossibly heavy in their hands, while her environmental suit registered atmosphere that should have been lethal, but somehow sustained human life perfectly. The 7 dragons surrounded the terrified humans, but their posture was curious rather than threatening. Nova approached Vex slowly, her starlight scales shimmering with patterns that seemed to shift with her emotional state. When she spoke, her words resonated directly in the Admiral's mind, carrying meaning that transcended language barriers. Through their shared consciousness, Nova showed Vex the history of Drakmor from a dragon's perspective. She experienced the joy of flight through crystal skies unpolluted by industrial waste, felt the deep contentment of a species that lived in harmony with natural forces spanning geological ages. Then came the creeping horror of watching their world change, the slow poisoning of air and water and energy that gradually made their planet uninhabitable for their kind. Vex saw the great nests falling silent one by one, as fewer eggs hatched successfully each year. She felt the desperate grief of parents watching their children die from environmental toxins that human technology had introduced without thought or consideration. She witnessed the retreat to deeper sanctuaries as civilization after civilization collapsed under the weight of ecological disruption. Most powerfully, she experienced the moment when Azura and Pyrian realized they would be the last of their kind unless a miracle occurred. The crushing despair of watching millions of years of accumulated wisdom and beauty prepare to vanish forever. The impossible hope that led them to attempt one final hatching, despite knowing it would likely fail like all the others. And then Marcus had arrived, bringing with him the one thing dragons needed most, someone willing to sacrifice everything to protect innocent life. Through his bonding with the eggs, 7 miracles had been born into a universe that had forgotten how to nurture wonder. When the vision ended, Admiral Vex found tears streaming down her face. The tactical displays on her wrist showed enemy positions and threat assessments, but she could no longer think of these magnificent beings as targets to be eliminated. They weren't invaders or monsters. They were refugees in their own world, struggling to survive humanity's thoughtless expansion across the galaxy. "Why show me this?" she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion she hadn't felt since childhood. Marcus stepped closer, his spiritual form radiating compassion that transcended the boundaries between species. "Because you have a choice to make, Admiral. You can continue this attack and probably succeed in destroying the last 7 dragons in existence. Your superiors will reward you handsomely for eliminating a perceived threat to corporate profits, or you can help us find a different path forward." Sage spread his wings and shared his own visions with the human commander, showing her possible futures that branched from this crucial moment. In one timeline, the dragons died here and now, their unique gifts lost forever as humanity continued its relentless consumption of natural resources. Worlds turned to deserts, species vanished by the thousands, and eventually the galaxy itself began to die as the delicate balances that sustained life collapsed under technological pressure. But there was another possibility, one where human ambition learned to work with dragon wisdom instead of opposing it. Vex saw cities that grew like living organisms, adapting to their environments rather than dominating them. She witnessed technologies that enhanced natural processes instead of replacing them, creating abundance without waste or pollution. Most remarkably, she experienced the joy of partnerships between species that brought out the best qualities in both. "It's impossible," Vex said, but her voice carried hope rather than despair. "The corporations will never accept coexistence with creatures they can't control or profit from." Marcus smiled, and for a moment his spiritual form seemed fully solid, fully alive. Then we'll have to change their minds, won't we? Show them that working with dragons is more profitable than fighting them. Demonstrate that these children can solve problems no human technology can address. Crystal stepped forward and placed one clawed hand on a section of damaged bulkhead that had been transported with Admiral Vex. Before the human's amazed eyes, the twisted metal flowed like liquid, reshaping itself into perfect condition while somehow becoming stronger than the original material. The dragon's molecular manipulation abilities could revolutionize manufacturing, making resource scarcity a thing of the past. Thunder called down a miniature storm in one corner of the chamber, then showed how the electrical discharge could be captured and stored in crystal matrices that made conventional batteries look primitive. Harmony demonstrated her healing powers by repairing stress fractures in Admiral Vex's combat armor, while Ember created heat patterns that could forge exotic alloys impossible to produce through conventional means. Each dragon possessed abilities that could benefit humanity immensely, but only if they were treated as partners rather than prisoners. Their gifts required trust and cooperation to function properly, qualities that couldn't be extracted through force or intimidation. Admiral Vex realized she was witnessing the birth of a new age, one where the impossible became routine through collaboration between species that had evolved different strengths. The tactical part of her mind immediately began calculating the strategic advantages such partnerships could provide, while her human heart responded to the simple beauty of beings who embodied hope in its purest form. "What do you need from me?" she asked, her decision crystallizing as she spoke. Marcus gestured toward the chamber's exit where ancient passages led back to the surface world. "Help us reach the stars, Admiral. These children are the seeds of something greater than either of our species could achieve alone, but they need time to grow, and protection while they learn to navigate a galaxy that doesn't understand their value." As Admiral Sarah Vex prepared to make the most important decision of her career, she felt the weight of history settling on her shoulders. In the next few hours, she would either become the destroyer of the last dragons or the architect of a future neither species could imagine alone. 3 years had passed since Admiral Vex's fleet withdrew from Drakmor, carrying with them a story that would reshape humanity's understanding of its place in the galaxy. The corporate boardrooms that had ordered the dragon's destruction now competed fiercely for partnership agreements with beings whose abilities could solve seemingly impossible engineering challenges. What began as a military operation had transformed into the most profitable technological exchange in human history. Marcus Kane stood on the observation deck of Harmony Station, a massive orbital platform jointly constructed by human engineers and dragon artisans. Through the transparent aluminum windows, he watched his 7 charges soar through space itself, their wings adapted to solar winds and cosmic radiation through careful genetic modification, guided by Crystal's molecular expertise. They were no longer the frightened hatchlings he had died protecting, but magnificent adults beginning to explore their true potential. The transformation hadn't been easy. Convincing the Terran Corporate Council to abandon their extraction operation had required demonstrations of power that left no doubt about the consequences of continued aggression. Thunder had redirected a solar storm to disable an entire fleet, while Shadow had transported their admiral's personal shuttle to the center of a black hole and back again just to make a point. The message was clear. Dragons could be valuable allies or devastating enemies, but they would never again be victims. Admiral Vex, now director of the Dragon Human Cooperative Initiative, approached Marcus with the latest reports from their joint exploration missions. The 7 dragons had proven invaluable for investigating phenomena that human technology couldn't safely approach. Nova's energy manipulation abilities allowed her to communicate with living plasma entities in stellar coronas, while Sage's predictive gifts had prevented 3 separate, first-contact disasters with species whose thought patterns operated on completely different temporal scales. The Andromeda expedition is requesting Ember and Crystal for their next phase, Vex reported, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had found their true calling. They've discovered some kind of crystalline intelligence that only responds to dragon frequency communications. The potential applications for quantum computing are staggering. Marcus nodded, watching Ember practice complex aerial maneuvers with her siblings. The fierce little dragon who had once been small enough to hold in his arms now measured over 50 meters from nose to tail, her scales blazing with inner fire that could forge matter at the subatomic level. Each of the 7 had grown into their unique gifts, becoming specialists whose abilities complemented each other perfectly. But their greatest achievement wasn't technological, it was social. The sight of dragons and humans working together had inspired a cultural revolution that spread across dozens of worlds. Children grew up dreaming of bonding with dragon partners, while artists created masterpieces depicting the harmony possible between species that chose cooperation over conquest. The old corporate model of exploitation was giving way to something unprecedented in galactic history. "There's something else," Vex continued, her expression growing serious. "Long-range sensors have detected energy signatures similar to those we found on Drakmor. 17 different systems showing signs of dragon civilization, some of them still active. It appears your children weren't quite as alone as we thought." Marcus felt a surge of joy that transcended his spiritual nature. The possibility that other dragons had survived humanity's expansion had always existed, but confirmation filled him with hope for the future. His 7 charges would no longer carry the burden of being the last of their kind. They could learn from elders who remembered the old ways while teaching them about the new possibilities that cooperation with humanity offered. Harmony flew closer to the station, her scales shifting to mirror the starfield beyond as she communicated directly with Marcus through their unbreakable bond. She had sensed something approaching through dimensions that human instruments couldn't detect, something ancient and powerful and radiating the unmistakable presence of dragonkind. The space around Harmony Station shimmered as reality folded in ways that hurt to observe directly. Through the dimensional rift stepped Azura and Pyrrhion, their forms somehow even more magnificent than Marcus remembered. But they weren't alone. Behind them came other dragons, dozens of them, representing bloodlines and flights that had hidden in the deep places between stars, while waiting for the galaxy to become safe for their kind again. The ancient dragons surrounded Marcus's spiritual form, their voices raised in harmonies that made the station's hull ring like a vast bell. They sang of his sacrifice, of the warm heart that had chosen love over life and transformation over oblivion. But more than that, they sang of what his choice had created, not just the salvation of 7 eggs, but the foundation for a new age where dragons could once again soar freely through the cosmos. The eldest among them, a dragon whose scales seemed to contain entire galaxies, spoke with a voice that resonated across multiple dimensions simultaneously. She was called the Dreamkeeper, guardian of memories that spanned the rise and fall of civilizations. Through her words, Marcus learned that his actions on Drakmor had been felt throughout the hidden dragon sanctuaries, inspiring others to emerge from their protective isolation and take their chances with a humanity that had proven capable of honor. "You have given us more than life," the Dreamkeeper said, her mental voice carrying the gratitude of an entire species. "You have given us hope. Because of your sacrifice, dragon children will once again play in the light of distant suns, and the songs of our people will echo through the void until the stars themselves grow cold." As the reunion continued around him, Marcus felt a change beginning in his own spiritual nature. The bonds that had kept him tethered to the physical realm were loosening, his purpose fulfilled beyond all expectations. The 7 young dragons he had died to protect were now adults capable of shaping the galaxy's future, and their species was no longer balanced on the edge of extinction. But rather than fading into peaceful rest, Marcus found himself being offered a choice that transcended anything he had imagined possible. The collective consciousness of dragonkind invited him to become something new, not just a guardian spirit bound to 7 individuals, but a bridge between species that could exist wherever humans and dragons worked together. His sacrifice had earned him a place in the living mythology of 2 civilizations, a role that would let him guide and protect the partnerships that would reshape the galaxy. The decision was easier than it had been in the Crystal Chamber years ago. Marcus accepted the transformation, feeling his consciousness expand to encompass every world where dragons and humans stood together beneath alien skies. He would be the memory that kept both species true to their highest ideals, the voice that whispered caution when ambition threatened to overcome wisdom. In sanctuaries scattered across the galaxy, dragon eggs began to glow with new life as their species prepared for a renaissance that would echo through the ages. And watching over them all, a human spirit who had chosen love over life continued his eternal vigil, ensuring that the warm heart that had saved 7 children would protect countless more in the years to come. The outcast warrior had found his place at last, not in the ranks of any army, but in the legends that would inspire generations yet unborn. His story would be told wherever beings chose sacrifice over safety, wherever compassion triumphed over fear, wherever two species looked up at the same stars and dared to dream of flying among them together. And in that eternal moment between heartbeats, between breaths, between the dying of one age and the birth of another, Marcus Kane smiled and knew that some honors could never be taken away, only earned through the courage to love something more than your own life. The dragons had honored his warm heart with the greatest gift of all, the chance to watch love transform the galaxy itself into something worthy of the stars.